Hey there, Autism Fitness founder Eric Chessen, leading the movement for movement and bringing you another edition of Autism Fitness Tuesday training, where I take a concept, a strategy, a practice that we have in autism fitness and bring it to you in a distilled, filtered way so that you can apply it to your autism and neurodivergent life skill athletes, whether you're in a clinic, in a school, in a gym, or at home. And before I get started, please definitely subscribe and share this video with someone for whom it might make a difference in their programming, whether they are just starting out or they've been doing it for decades and decades and decades. And if you're interested in becoming an Autism Fitness Certified Pro, you can head on over to autismfitness.com. There is a link in the description below. If this is on YouTube, if I've shared it somewhere else, there's maybe not a link in the description below, but it's still at autismfitness.com. Anyway, in this edition, I'm going to be talking about the three different levels that we have of any exercise, and of course relating them back to the PAC profile. That's physical, adaptive, and cognitive. That is our standard operating procedure. That's our foundation in autism fitness. Nothing happens without the PAC profile and assessing and addressing each of those three areas of skill. Of course, they also have some interaction with each other, so it's something to keep in mind. It's something that we cover in the pro certification. So when we talk about the three different levels of an exercise for any athlete, one important thing to keep in mind is that, and you may already be familiar with this, the autism population, whether we're talking about young individuals, adolescents, teens, adults, geriatrics, there are a lot of motor and strength deficits that we tend to come into contact with that are experienced by the ASD population. And some of this has to do with neuromuscular functioning, and some of it also has to do with the fact that many individuals on the autism spectrum, unfortunately, are not physically active and do not have a structured fitness or training program. Of course, we're talking predominantly about resistance-based exercises because those are going to develop the strength and motor planning and skills that are have the highest likelihood of generalizing to activities of daily living over any other exercises. So our squats, presses, hinges, pulls, all of the things that we do in autism fitness programming. But it's not just about the exercise itself, although exercise selection is an exceedingly important component of programming. You can't have a program without exercises, and exercise selection should not be arbitrary. It shouldn't be a what do we want to do today, because then it's not going to have a linear progression. So skill development occurs with repetition. So without repetition, when we're just doing a lot of variety without there being ongoing training and practice, then the skill isn't going to be developed, so we're not going to see a lot of generalization. And for many of our ASD life skill athletes, they need a lot of time and practice with the same movement over and over and over to commit it to not only working memory, but just actually physiologically working, being capable of performing that exercise safely and effectively so that it shows up in different environments, different situations, and the athlete is confident and capable in performing that movement pattern. So when we look at some of the exercises that we utilize in autism fitness, and again, there's no such thing as an autism-specific exercises. So the exercises that we know are going to have an immense amount of value to any human being are the ones that we're going to include in our programs for our ASD and neurodivergent athletes. So again, squats, presses, pulls, carries, these big multi-joint compound exercises. If you're not familiar with some of those terms, that's okay. I'll explain a little more as we go on. But for those of you who are familiar, yes, we're using some of the same basic strengthening exercises that we would use with a neurotypical individual, because they're going to have the same, if not more, benefit for our ASD population. Now, just because we have good exercises selected does not mean that the exercise automatically is going to serve the purpose that it needs to serve. So if we think about an exercise as a tool, we need to understand how the tool is supposed to perform, what we're supposed to do with it, how it's supposed to be utilized in any given situation so that we can get the most out of it. So just programming a squat or just instructing an athlete to squat doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to do it correctly or to standard. I'm going to go over that definition in a minute, simply by way of us coaching it, even if we have a motivated athlete. And oftentimes the case may be that we have a motivated and engaged athlete who wants to perform the exercise, but physiologically, they just don't have that strength and stability or the motor planning to do it just yet. So motivation is great, but motivation does not automatically equal good or great performance of the exercise. And that's okay, but it's our job as the coach, as the person who's assessing and addressing those physical skills, to understand what we're seeing when that athlete is performing that movement, so that, again, we can assign it to one of these three categories. So here we go. We have our standard. So the standard performance of any of these exercises means that the athlete can perform that exercise, that movement pattern, safely, with stability, independently, through a full, healthy range of motion. So if they're squatting, for example, they can squat below parallel, they can get their backside below parallel, down towards the ground, because we're going to have the greatest contraction of all of those important muscles in the leg, and of course in the legs, and of course trunk stability and all the good things that come physically with squatting. So at standard, an athlete is able to do about 3 sets of 10 repetitions, because that tells us that that athlete has that exercise mastered. They can do it independently. Every once in a while, they need an additional cue, or they self-regulate or self-adjust. Not every repetition needs to be perfect, but the athlete can perform that exercise with full range of motion, with stability, with strength, consistently across a series of sessions. And that's when we know that the athlete has this movement pattern down. And that's really important. So standard is kind of our base, or our middle. And then on the left side of standard, we have modification. So many of our athletes start out at a less than standard performance of that exercise. And it's important to take into consideration that this is not their fault. This is not something that they're trying to do. They simply don't have the physical skill. And one of the biggest mistakes that can be made is to attempt to somehow talk or coach or instruct the athlete into being able to do something that they're not yet physically capable of doing. It's like somebody who has only squatted with a barbell and then saying, okay, well, it's time to have 225 pounds on your back. They are not yet at that stage where 225 pounds is anywhere near an appropriate amount of weight. So even when we have an athlete who is unloaded with weight and they're just doing body weight for that squat, it doesn't necessarily mean that they yet have the skill, that motor planning, that motor control, that strength, in order to be able to do it effectively. And that's why we as coaches need to understand how to modify the exercise. So a modification is one or more ways that we simplify or lessen the challenge of a particular exercise. So with that squat example, we can have the athlete squat to an elevated platform. I have plenty of videos on this as well, plenty of video examples on Instagram of numerous athletes that I have of all ages and and certain ability levels where they're not yet at that standard performance, squatting to that box or squatting to a bench or squatting to a platform, because it affords them both a visual and spatial and kinesthetic reflection point or cue, so that that athlete knows how low to go, and just as importantly, they can control their descent or that lowering down to the box, because the slower, within reason, that athlete lowers to the box or lowers to the platform, the more effective that squat is going to be. There is a big difference between squatting with control and just bouncing or crashing down. Bouncing and crashing down is not really a squat. It's more of a sitting down really quickly. So it's not going to have that same training effect or benefit to the muscles in the legs. It's not going to work the same way. Again, coming back to the idea that the exercise is a tool, something that we utilize in order to have a specific outcome. If the athlete is unable to control that squat, then we want to elevate the platform and give them a surface to squat to, because just having them squat over and over and over with poor form, it's not going to make the squat any more effective. So repetition without that intervention of the modification, a lot of words there, intervention or not having the intervention with the modification is not going to improve the squat. There's something that we as coaches need to implement in order to make sure that the athlete is able to perform at their current best, which may not be to standard yet. That's why we modify. The other thing that we can do with the squat, so we have our elevated platform, and we're going to elevate it to the point that the athlete can squat effectively, is if we have an athlete who's folding forward, so they're losing trunk stability, then we can have a band held out for them, and this is something that we cover in the Autism Fitness curriculum, holding onto a band to create that trunk stability for them. Of course, we're going to do that for as short a time as possible, because eventually, once the athlete has developed that trunk stability, we want to have them perform the squat as independently as possible so we can fade or eventually remove that band support for the athlete. So we have two different ways to modify that particular exercise. With the squat, we have an elevated surface, and then we have the athlete holding on to a band as well, because it's going to provide the support and the scaffolding for that athlete to be able to do that exercise to the best of their current ability, even though it is currently a modified exercise. So we don't need to just start off with the standard and say, well, they can't do it, so let's have them keep doing it until something happens. That is not an effective way to eventually get to the point where the athlete has that strength and has that stability and has that motor planning skill. So we want to be able to scaffold it. In order to do that, we have to have these modifications. And for every one of these strength exercises that we utilize in autism fitness programming, we have a specific set of criteria, these strategies that allow us and allow our coaches to modify the exercise to the point at which the athlete can perform the exercise safely and effectively enough that we are starting to get that training effect. The training effect is where the athlete starts to get stronger, starts to move better, and you may even see them start to generalize that to activities of daily living, because that is the goal. To have the athlete develop these skills, not just for the gym and not just in the clinic, but so that they show up in these really critical areas of life on a daily basis. So when we talk about life skill athletes, that's what we're doing. Providing a training program that is going to improve physical performance in all different areas so that our athletes are more independent, so that they are more capable, and so that they're more confident in their day-to-day lives. So from modification, eventually we get an athlete to standard with an exercise where they can perform 10 repetition, 3 sets of 10 repetitions. So it's enough training volume, that meaning sets and repetitions, that they are moving better, that they're getting stronger, that they have that strength endurance, that it's showing up in other places. Great. Once they meet that standard, then we can go on to progression. Now, progression should be the easiest part of any program, especially with strength training. So we're looking at a few different ways to progress an exercise. And particularly when we're talking about strength, we can add sets, we can add repetitions, and we can add resistance. So if it's a cable row or a band row, we can add more resistance to it or more weight. If it's an overhead press with a pair of soft bells or a pair of sand bells or a pair of dumbbells, we can add more weight, or we can go from 10 repetitions to 12 repetitions, or 12 repetitions to 15 repetitions, all right, even up to somewhere in the neighborhood of 20. Or we can add more weight, and then the athlete goes from 12 repetitions down to 10 repetitions, because more weight is going to be more challenging. As long as the athlete is performing the exercise safely with appropriate motor control, something that we want to be keenly aware of when we're coaching, we can continue to progress that exercise. Now, there are two different considerations with progression. Progression can be from standard, so we go from the athlete meeting the standard for that exercise to adding more weight or adding more sets or adding more repetitions. But when we have an athlete who is starting out at a modified or less challenging variation of that exercise, sometimes we are progressing them more individually. So the athlete may be well above parallel with that squat, so they're not quite below parallel yet, not getting everything that they possibly can out of that exercise, but gradually we are lowering the box and lowering the box and lowering the box until the athlete can safely and comfortably and with motor control lower themselves and then stand back up instead of crashing down to that box. So with progression, we have our progression from the standard of the exercise, and then we have individual progression as well. When an athlete is working their way from a modified variation of that exercise to standard. So there are going to be some steps, no pun intended, along the way of that. So those are our three different phases or different strata of an exercise. You have your standard, we have our modification if an athlete cannot yet perform that exercise to standard, and of course we have progressions where the exercise can become more challenging. Now, one note about progressions that's really important. Sometimes the idea that having more variety is going to equal a better training program becomes a little bit pervasive, and it is oftentimes a mistake because the athlete has not yet gotten all that they possibly can out of that push-up or out of that overhead press, out of that squat. Those who make the most progress in the gym, in their training, wherever they're doing their strength training, are typically the ones who are adhering to a relatively simple program. So once someone can press a certain amount of weight overhead, it does not mean that it's time to start standing on a balance ball or an unstable surface or standing on one leg to make it more challenging, because these things are more complicated, but they definitely do not make the exercise any better. In fact, they added or they detract the effectiveness of that exercise. So we want to stay away from variety that makes it a circus trick. Every once in a while, once an exercise is significantly progressed, we can try a different variation, a different angle, or maybe go unilateral with one arm. Or try depending on the exercise, trying it seated instead of standing. But it's not as though every variation of an exercise is going to elicit an extremely different response from the muscle group that we are targeting. So for example, a single arm band or cable row is not going to be all that different from a bilateral or two arm cable row or pull. Is there a little bit more of a trunk stability challenge? Sure, but not by much. We're talking about, mere percentage points here. So the idea is not to have so much variety that the skill doesn't develop or the athlete doesn't continue to progress with that particular exercise. The idea is to keep going with that exercise. In the strength training world, in the athletic world, people who have been doing the same exercises, their squats, their hinges, push-ups, pulls, in different variations of pulls, whether it's a pull-up or an inverted row or a cable row, those tend to be the people who make the most progress, not the people who are jumping from one exercise to another exercise to another exercise every week and not having any consistency. So consistency is a big factor in progress, whether we're talking about the neurotypical population or, and especially in this case, the autism and neurodivergent population. So to encapsulate all this, with any exercise that we incorporate, we're going to have the standard. That's where the athlete can perform it safely, effectively, and independently. If they are not yet at that stage physically, then we can modify the exercise and decrease the level of challenge for them and gradually build up their strength, stability, and motor planning so they get to that standard. And once they get to that standard, we can start progressing it. Last thing I'll mention is that sometimes we need to modify an exercise due to adaptive reasons. The athlete's ability or challenges around motivation and focus. So one example is if we have an athlete who we know is capable of doing 8 repetitions of a medicine ball push throw. However, they're getting dysregulated after 2 or 3 repetitions. So even though physically we're pretty sure that they have that skill, they haven't demonstrated it, and there are certain factors, i.e. that behavioral dysregulation, that are going to prohibit that athlete from engaging fully in that set of 8 repetitions. So we want to gradually build it up, not because the athlete doesn't have the physical skill, but because we need to enable them to increase their motivation to stay with the exercise for 6, 7, and eventually those 8 throws. So sometimes we're modifying strictly from a physiological perspective, and sometimes we're modifying because the athlete is getting dysregulated or they're not yet ready to attend to a full set of 8 repetitions. Something really important to keep in mind, and that's something that we absolutely cover in the Autism Fitness Pro course as well. So I hope this has been helpful and maybe shed some light or provided some new information about how we look at exercises, not just as the exercise itself, but on a scale of where the performance is right now. Because yes, a squat is a squat, but it's also how well the athlete is currently performing that squat or that overhead press or that push-up that's going to determine how we program it. So there are some really important factors in providing the athlete with the best possible experience so we get the best possible outcomes. I'd love to know what you think about this, if it's been helpful, if it's something new to you, if it's something that you're already doing. If it is, leave that in the comments below. If there's something that you'd love to learn more about, either in this topic or something completely different, leave that in the comments below as well. Definitely helps the algorithm. And if you're interested in becoming an Autism Fitness Certified Pro, you can head on over to autismfitness.com, download the course syllabus, and learn all about what it is to join the Autism Fitness Movement for Movement. I'm Autism Fitness founder Eric Chessen, leading the movement for movement. Thank you for watching.